Yeah, so yesterday we did an appointment bundle query. So Dr. Pramod actually asked me offline, how would we deal with if there is a service request, right? So appointment can also mean there is a lab or a diagnostic appointment, right? So appointment is a very complex resource. If it is a direct doctor walk-in, then we just have, there is no service request there. But in most cases, at least in India, the doctor would order some tests to be done, and that would be a service request, right? So there would be a service request, a FHIR resource generated. And while booking the appointment, there is an option to state that this service request, so there is a based on field in the service request. Can show the FHIR resource. Yeah, so here is where we mention that based on, and in the actor type, because it is a test, there could be a device, and we also mark the device in the appointment that this device is also needed, and the schedule for the schedule and the slot for the device also should be updated with this appointment. So that's how we could automate. So a lab or an EHR, any system that is using or used in a hospital environment, can set this up and just trigger an appointment resource to any server that is using FHIR, and the appointment would be shown in the same way, right? Even changes to the appointment could be handled, they can do it in the EHR, and that could come out and be updated exactly in all other apps, right? So with that, let me just ask, are there any questions from yesterday? Some of you have joined yesterday. Okay, let's go through. So Asymmetrik GraphQL is, Asymmetrik is a company based out of Netherlands, and they have built out this GraphQL server. GraphQL in itself is its own language, it's not JavaScript, but so there is also a JavaScript portion to it, and they have used JavaScript mostly to connect this. There are a few open items. One of the item I marked there was, is there a plan to support GraphQL directives like flatten and first? Flatten would be nice. So the response was that they're looking for help. So this is something, if anyone is interested, I want to do it, maybe not at this point when I get settled with my implementation, right? Then they also there was a question like, would you support UK core, right? So there was no response to that. Similarly, US core, a lot could be done if we believe that this is a good implementation to take forward, right? That after that, so GraphQL REST versus REST, is it one versus other, or can both exist? So GraphQL, the reason I put it as GraphQL REST is GraphQL is also a REST implementation. Although we don't see it like that, but the underlying implementation is all REST, right? So and it is not mutually exclusive. So, and there is no one size fits all. It depends on what we are trying to do exactly, and what is the technology decisions that we have made, and which one suits best, right? But there are a few problems, or problems are things that we need to be aware when we are using GraphQL. One is the schema duplication. Because it's GraphQL is a closely typed language. We saw the schemas yesterday, that in some cases, the same schema you are duplicating in multiple places. This is similar to what you had structured programming and then came object-oriented programming. But if we made our schemas modular, then it is possible to reuse them. And these guys have done a good job in doing those schemas. There is a line I will quote in the last from a Facebook conference. Then what they say there is that don't build your own schemas. So I'll quote that in the end. Then there is a server client data mismatch. What that means is because you are tightly coupling GraphQL, any changes on the server should also be reflected on the client side. This is something actually I face an issue even today. But an alternative solution is that keep your clients dumb. Just do a simple query to the server and let the server do all the manipulations for you and bring it back to you. But it needs to be a decision that needs to be thought after, because there is an additional step involved. But I think it's worth paying the price, because otherwise our clients also need to be smart enough to understand GraphQL, and it's a bit of a problem. This one, the superfluous database calls. Now, database design is actually an art. So the fundamental argument, and I have quoted the source from where I have taken this, and this is a very decent enough blog, although it's little old. It's from 2017, I think. And in technologies like this, things change pretty fast. What was 6 months back is no longer true. But the superfluous database calls is a problem, meaning let's say that you're chaining from one resource to another. Let's say there is an appointment resource, and we saw in an appointment there is a practitioner, patient, a healthcare service, device, location, all those resources. So if you want to get information from each one of them, and if we're not doing it right, we are making multiple redundant database calls to get this information. So what effectively is happening is, to make your network and to make your bundle lighter, the load on the database is more, and that's obviously hits on the total cost of optimization standpoint. But I have a view on this, and I'm not debating it. When you come to FHIR resource, so it's not like one call will fetch you the whole world. There are capacity units, and once you exhaust that, and it is treated as another call. So while we are doing FHIR queries, you will most likely meet that upper limit of the capacity unit if we design it well. So superfluous database calls, I think that is why FHIR GraphQL also needed a good example that it could support. I have quoted a few reference links also, where initial GraphQL training on how to get started with GraphQL training. Most of those examples, they use a books example where there is an author and they have later written multiple books, and then there's a genre of their books, and you could query on them. That is not a good example. I mean, that's not as complex as FHIR. So GraphQL needed a complex problem. So if GraphQL is a solution, then FHIR is a problem. So I think GraphQL fits it, but I'm not prescribing it. There is no one size fits all. There is also this problem of poor performance, but however, I think it is not as much a problem. Poor performance in the sense that you make a REST call and you hit the server and you get what you want. In this case, what is happening is you make a REST call, it's going to a GraphQL endpoint, then GraphQL internally does all its manipulations on the data layer. It makes you data layer agnostic, meaning you can put a database, you can put a file system, anything beyond that, beyond the data layer, and your client doesn't need to know what that is. But it is still a layer nevertheless. So that might add burden if your server is not scalable enough, but with cloud computing and modern architectures, that could be overcome easily. But in most cases, so like I said, so there is no one size fits all, meaning if you are always querying resources and you want the full fields on a resource, then there's no point in using GraphQL, because GraphQL helps you where you want to query only a portion of a resource and you don't want the rest of the things. So if your requirement is always to get the complete resource, then there is no point, and it's just an additional headache to have. So that's where it is not mutually exclusive, meaning you can have a GraphQL endpoint, but you can also have a REST endpoint, say that, and you can query, you can decide which endpoint to use for what purpose. Right? It's like one server implementation. Then there is a boilerplate overdose. So this is what I said, like all that typed coupling. Any change you make anywhere, it crashes your app. So we need to be very careful when we do things like this. And that too, when coming to FHIR, the data sets are extremely complex. So these are very well, so this should not be looked at as problem alone, but it should also be looked at as a good critique of, do we need to use GraphQL or do we not need GraphQL? It depends on the implementation. But I will add one point that if we are using mobile clients and intermittent networks, we are not left with a lot of choices. There are innovative ways in REST also to query, as Kumar Satyam pointed a few yesterday, to query only what you want. But GraphQL does that much more easily. So Nilesh had a question. Does it mean more applicable for client-specific APIs, experience APIs maintained by consumer application team behind API gateway that massage data orchestration from system API? Nilesh, can you explain to me what do you mean? I didn't get the full question.
So normally, when you are building APIs which are client agnostic,
Yeah.
the interface will be dictated by the resource design, right? Which mimic the domain model information, right? Information design in the domain model. When you are saying the GraphQL is not applicable in those scenarios, but it is more about your scraping information as you need. In API designing model, you will always have APIs that are catering to different types of clients, but then within client world, you may create your own APIs that orchestrate your client specific experience, which is after invoking multiple APIs behind the scene. And those APIs could be the which are the backend APIs we call, or the APIs that are having business orchestration scenarios inbuilt in it, and then those massaged APIs which are taking data from so in this case appointment. If you are looking at serving appointment information in conjunction with the associated chart and a practitioner on specific date, right? So the appointment resource itself, appointment API itself, may not bring that information to a particular client. So this client application, which is building API by making calls to multiple resources, right, on a separate call, they may create their own bundle in the world of FHIR and coming that out as a specific API. So is GraphQL going to be a good equivalent replacement or substitution for that kind of scenario?
Yeah, so that kind of thing, GraphQL does it very well. So that's what I've showed in that appointment example. So if your interest is in just to know what is the appointment, what time, what is the patient's name, right? So GraphQL runs that bundle query and it returns you only those fields you have asked for. So your clients are much more happier. So let's say you have a mobile client. So your mobile client will only use those, take those fields that are returned from GraphQL. GraphQL internally queries those resources on the server side. But when it sends to the client, it only sends this lean bundle.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Any more questions?
The only fear about GraphQL is, in whatever time, next year, 2 years, if Facebook is split, then who's going to maintain GraphQL?
That's a good question. So as of now, GraphQL is under GraphQL Foundation, right? And even the ownership of GraphQL Foundation can be debated. But a lot of the GitHub libraries of GraphQL are having MIT licenses. So what I mean to say that is, if you are using a JavaScript world, it's probably open source already. So it has a GraphQL.js already has an open source MIT license. Similarly, more and more are becoming open sourced. So in 2018, I think there was a move to not make it open source, and a lot of developer community resisted Facebook. and Facebook agreed to open up even more. So I believe the trend is whatever happens to Facebook or anyone else, right? This will get even more wider reach as we progress. And FHIR itself is in its initial days. When it gets its wider reach, I think it will remain as open source. That's my belief. Similarly, if I can slightly deviate, Nilesh, similar is the case with React Native, right? So who owns or React Native? So who owns it? So it's developed. It's not similar to Angular, but React Native community is very wide. And
I don't want to come across against these things, but that's one reason I have stayed away from Facebook for everything.
Okay, fine.
Yeah. That's my personal goal.
Yeah.
But your point is, I mean, example is pretty valid there, right?
Yeah.
As long as it's maintained by open source and it's widely used, hopefully all of that will come into the consideration when the US Congress acts on the decision of splitting, which is, I think it's very likely going to happen. Right?
Yeah.
Very likely.
Yeah.
But it is what it is, right? Now, about GraphQL, are there any, just like for FHIR, there's a .NET client. I mean, I'm speaking again from that aspect. Not that I'm dominating the conversation here, but FHIR team is building that API. For GraphQL, is there any open source model that that API that exists that could help us accelerating building GraphQL APIs, which can run on top of FHIR APIs?
Yes, yeah. So the server that I'm going to show you is that exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's more of JavaScript implementation. So if you're looking for .NET, I think there are some libraries that are on the GraphQL GitHub itself.
Okay.
But I'm not exactly sure. So if it is FHIR, right? So it's probably a question that's better asked to FHIR. Because a lot of guys
I don't
want
think
to...
FHIR is supporting GraphQL.
Okay, I think, okay, Happy is probably supporting GraphQL.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, so, but that's the question. A lot of guys want to support GraphQL, at least in principle. That's what I know as a fact. But if you're using an API design and if you're okay with JavaScript, then this one is a good enough choice. So the asymmetric GraphQL, like any others, so there will be an SRC and there will be an index.js. So can I assume, so how many participants do we have? Okay, we have 10. So may I ask if you're okay, I mean, if you're familiar with JavaScript?
10 of them.
Sorry, Santosh, I didn't get it. Santosh?
Venu, may I ask something? I'm
Yes,
asking
sir.
you for an addition to your query of appointments and replying on that provider, right? Bring a little clinical angle. Appointments, how many of them had a test of RT-PCR which was positive?
Yes, Dr. Pramod, it is possible. It is possible to do that.
Yeah, all you need to ask is that please check if that patient had an RT-PCR, and if it was so, it was positive. Was it positive? That's the query that has to go along with it.
Yes, that is possible to do that kind of query. It's possible. I missed your question in between. Like I had a bad connection. So is there more to that, or is it just like can I know?
No,
if,
I just says you're asking how many appointments this provider got, and I also want to know among those appointments how many of them came within RT, because I'm assuming that this is a doctor who says an internal medicine and he's got a number of his patients who've got cough, etc., and ask for RT-PCR. right? So my interest is knowing out of 10 patients he's seen today, how many of them are RT-PCR positive? Very simple. Or whatever percentage, how many of them are RT-PCR positive? That is my interest.
Yeah, it is possible to query.
This is being because it's a COVID region, you will have a significant more RT-PCR positive.
Yeah, it is possible. What I don't know exactly is, so let's say that somebody is RT-PCR, you'll probably put that in a condition or observation or somewhere, right?
Yeah.
You will put that in it will have to be an investigation result, diagnostic report of RT-PCR positive. That's it.
Okay, diagnostic report. Yeah, so we just
as good as like you are having a reverse include then in that case.
Right. So it is possible to have that kind of
and every time now I would advise that we will put one little clinical angle to your questions.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Sure. Venu. Yeah. Now on, we will always try and put in one little clinical angle to your questions, if you don't mind. All of you don't mind, because that is what it is. That's what it'll be. So let's see if we can bring in something like that.
Is that going to deviate from what he has planned for to present?
Well, that's what I'm expanding on his plan a little bit by saying you've got so many patients who had an appointment with that doctor that day. This is a post query. Therefore, I would also like to know those apparently have had RT-PCR positive, a diagnostic report of RT-PCR positive.
Yeah, Dr. Pramod, so it will deviate the plan a bit, but I'm okay so long as you ask me.
Maybe take a note of that, Venu. Take Dr. Jacob, take a note of that.
Yeah.
And we'll put some buffer to build on once your demo is completed. Will that work?
Yeah.
So it will build what you already have. Maybe next time, Venu or anybody, any one of us should ask for if there are any use cases to be considered in demoing.
Yeah. So that's why I said this may be like 2 or 3 sessions. So this is the second one. We can have a follow-up, right? Okay. Right.
Thanks.
Yeah. So I'm on the server construct. So if anyone is not aware of JavaScript, I would like to briefly show the package.json. If you're aware, then I'll breeze through this. So package.json just coming up on the screen. Yeah. So like any technology implementation, there should be an index.js, and when you run it, so it says that this is where I'm coming into based on what my mode of running is. So if I'm running in dev mode, I'll go somewhere else. If I'm running in production, I'll have a different script that has to be picked up. So that is the SRC folder structure. Let's go back to the PowerPoint. That's the SRC folder structure that I have shown, and it is typical to everything else. There is a bit of a config, which we will come to it. Then there is a middleware where all the authentication, authorization kind of stuff, passport kind of stuff happens. Utilities is another folder where it's used for the server, and resources is where all our FHIR profiles would stay on, right? So let's go to the next slide. Now so in the resources, and because GraphQL is typed, we have, it's just come up. Because GraphQL is typed tightly, so there are schemas. Schemas are mainly for the queries. So they contain your mappings to resources, and you can use them. And we did this yesterday when querying all the fields of a resource. Scalars are the constants, and inputs are when we try to do a CUD, create, update, delete operation. We have certain skeleton there which we could populate and push it. Parameters are the search parameters as defined by FHIR. And profiles you see on that right hand side, where each and every resource has a profile. So similarly, patient would be a profile, observation would be a profile, any FHIR resource that is R4 you would find this in this, right? And if you further expand on the profile, so I'm in the number 3, I'm showing the patient profile, and this is purely GraphQL. So we seen yesterday query and mutation. So if you want to do query and mutation, there would be one file where you would make the specification there, and there is a resolver where register is just an just like a log of these are all the possibilities of a resource called patient. That's register. Register doesn't do much. Resolver is where all the magic happens, where we write queries to whatever is the backend. So it could be a NoSQL MongoDB, it could be a SQL, it could be a MariaDB, or it could be a file system. So resolver.js is where we would put in the logic, where we ask GraphQL to make a query or a mutation and show us the result. And resolver also takes the additional load of giving it back to the server, and then and server sends it to the client. Right? Wait, just hold on. Can you go back here? Any questions here? It may be a bit superficial at this point, or a bit high level at this point. I'm just explaining here how the server construct for GraphQL is. More or less, this is the construct for every GraphQL server. Let's go to the next slide. So in the config is where we have the version. So if we want to support multiple versions, we could just add them, and it would default to that. Port is similar, what kind of logging you want to have. One parameter that I want to highlight here is the auth parameter. So this server has been coded to use Smart on FHIR bearer strategy. So Smart on FHIR says you have to use OAuth 2.0 and use a bearer strategy. So you have to use client ID, client secret, and also an introspection URL. So client ID, client secret, in most cases is suitable for a web related communication exchange, right? In mobile clients, the client secrets are not secure enough. So what we have done, and I don't know if it is the best practice, I think it is. What we have done is we have commented out the client secret, because the mobile client are anyway not going to use client secret and going to use an OAuth 2 authorization code flow. Right? There are other parameters like passport options we could set here. Introspection URL is also an important specification, and FHIR says that when you get a token from the client to the server, you always check the token with the authorization server or the token issuer, that when was the token issued, and is the token right? So because tokens are meant to be of universal format, anyone could mint a token, but if it has not come from the right source, so this is actually a check where we could stop it from further processing. So that's the auth. So it returns a simple function, smart bearer strategy. It returns a simple function, and whenever a request is made, it comes here. It triggers a smart bearer flow check, and if the flow passes, it will take it through the next process. Otherwise, it will stop here and throw an error. And these are all config parameters. And the resource config is just saying that, look, these are all my resource paths, and they would exist in this library. And what is the date config? I have added a DB user parameter here, but I don't have any recommendation on this. Because GraphQL Asymmetrik, when they did it, they just gave the bare metal and they did not give the DB connection options. They left it for the implementers to work it out. It is probably not a good idea to have a config parameter here, or there are other ways of putting them in parameter stores on cloud, or fetch them through an API. So whatever works for you. But it's still, the server needs a database connection like any other server. Then,
Quick,
so
quick question, yeah.
yes, Santosh,
Yeah.
go ahead.
So the auth token, that smart on fire, what you explained there. So any auth to server will do, and what identity server are we using for this example?
Okay, good question. In this example, I have not shown any auth server, but in my app, as of now, I'm using Okta. There are a few reasons for that. Right now, if you so there are various ways. I think even in the US, this has been a very hot topic. Let's say that you want to connect with an open ID, or you're not the ID provider and you want the patient to have one ID and connect to it, right? Then you should give them an option to bring in their ID and also mention the authorization code. So if it is a mobile client, then the authorization code would be a code grant flow, not a client ID, client secret flow. And then Smart on Fire also has scopes, which we will come later. So they are all the custom scopes, meaning user and resource, read or write. So these are the scopes. So if you are not an identity, I mean, if you are not issuing an ID yourself, and so in my app currently we integrate with Google and Facebook because they are open ID providers, and Facebook is by far the largest identity provider in the world. But we plan to extend this to any OpenID provider. For example, there are plans to make India's digital health identity as an OpenID. If that happens, then we would be able to integrate with NDHM's health ID. The idea is that we don't want to be the identity providers. Bring your identity. And if that is the case, a lot of these open IDs, Google, Facebook, Twitter, GitHub, so many of them, they don't have an option to embed custom scopes, right? So custom scopes meaning patient.read or patient.write, observation.read, right? So there is no way to have custom scopes like that. There are custom scopes like name, email, address. And then some others have some other custom scopes, but nowhere they give a complete authorization server to you where you could do that. So I'm using Okta for it, where I'm defining custom scopes, and I have provided a few access policies on that. But we're looking for open source servers. And Keycloak from the global FHIR community comes up as an option where we could probably use it as an open source implementation and host that server on your tenant. So maybe Keycloak. I have not yet gone to Keycloak, but I would like to go there.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's also a little different from the US and India. So US has this TEFCA, Trust Exchange Framework Consent Agreement. India is not the same. Primarily because India wants to, if India plans to issue a open health ID, which no country has, then it makes life a lot easier. But the consent framework of India is again different. Right? So the open ID is one piece and the consent is another piece, and we have to tie both, right? So implementers are doing it as per their specification and the regulation. Sorry, I gave a long answer.
Yeah, no, it is good. Thank you very much. Your connection, you're breaking up in between. Yeah.
Oh, is it? Sorry.
Is it just me or rest of them also having seen the?
Let me just check if my connection is good.
Thanks.
Okay, it seems my connection is bad. Let me change my connection. I may drop and come back. Is it better now? I'm back.
Yeah, it's better, Venu. Maybe you can speak a little more. I think we're good now.
Okay, yeah. So the smart bearer strategy, I was saying. So I have used Okta for my implementation, but I'm looking at Keycloak as an open source implementation that I want to move to. We have not yet made the decision. It's in the process.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. So. So I'm showing the construct here. So the four files we have seen in the profiles folder, right? Register is the first one where I'm just not doing anything. I'm just requiring the files that I want, and you will see them. So and two asterisks are the FHIR resources. So if it is patient, then it would look like patient create, patient update, patient remove. And if it is practitioner, then it would be practitioner. I'm requesting them here, and so I mean I'm just explaining a bare construct of the server, right? And then a instance path is actually made available. So for instance queries, there would be an instance path. So that's why it's not mutually exclusive. And for any GraphQL queries, it goes through the GraphQL query route. For any GraphQL updates, it goes through the mutation route. But then for any instance or a typical HTTP post kind of scenarios, it goes through the instance resource. We'll see more of this later. And this is the query. So because GraphQL uses schemas, operation outcome is a schema where if anything fails, you need to include an operation outcome with a suitable message. The bundle schema is where you are sending a list of patients or bundles of patients, and we use bundle schema. The asterisk is the resource. So for that specific schema, for that specific resource, right? And then the arguments are the search arguments. The resolvers also, we are requiring the resolvers here. They're written in another file. Just something like a get patient would mean that get patient from GraphQL. It's as simple as that. Get patient list is a bundle list. Get instance is the instance based query that I'm asking to fetch. Right. There is a bit of let's go to the Node.js VS Code.
The one other question, Venu here.
Yes.
So similar to REST API operations, right? We have those get, post, put. Those items are same here, or we have something else?
They're all same. They're all same. Just that we call them differently. Right.
We call them resolvers.
Yeah, we call them resolvers, but yeah, we call them resolvers, and I mean, you won't use the post verb. So GraphQL internally does that. Okay. We'll see that. We'll come to that. Right.
Okay.
Let's show the node modules and the scope invariant. So asymmetric server, can you expand this a bit? Asymmetric also implements the smart on FHIR strategy. But what I want to show quickly here is in the query, can you go to the PowerPoint once? In the query, you see here like scope invariant. So that scope invariant is coming from the node module, the GraphQL invariant, go into the index. And so what happens is that the function gets passed to this, the resolver function gets passed to this, and all the querying is happening from GraphQL from here, right? Now let's see what that scope invariant does in the PowerPoint. So to the scope invariant, we're passing two things. One is scope options, where for every resource, we are saying what are the allowed scopes, right? So if it is a query, then it's read. And this is again smart on FHIR spec. So we're saying read, but to the scope invariant, we are passing that query function we have imported from the query, right? So we'll pass these two functions, and then GraphQL internally goes and makes the call and brings us the result. One difference you'll see from the line here is, so this is a single get query, whereas this one is a get list query. And in the schema, you will see that this is using, so let's say if it is patient, the asterisk is patient. So it uses patient schema, whereas here it uses a bundle schema. So that's why, that is how it is able to recognize that a list query is a bundle query, because it uses a bundle schema, right? And we will see in further slides how the scope checking is actually happening. But let me pause. This is a bit of a high level abstract, but any questions here? I mean, I'm not expecting you to code right out of this.
What about this HTTP resolving the HTTP codes?
That will come in the next one,
okay,
in the result. Yeah. So let's go to the.
And there is no anything as an action as a read, because we have a read as well as a search, right? It's ultimately both of them are the get operation, but the action is always going to be the read for any type of a search query as well.
Yes, yeah. Let's go and see in the resolver how it works. Maybe you have to show a built-out resolver. Not now. Let's do the mutation. So in the mutation, we have the write args also, write and delete args. The invariant is the same, and the schemas are the same. But we use the args to pass to the scope invariant, and the scope invariant does the resolution for makes the calls for us. Right? Now let's go to the, and you can see the action is right here. So Smart on FHIR says two scopes, right? Read or write. That is why the server has read or write. But if you want to add more, then it's up to our implementation. Yeah, resolver. Let's go to resolver. So here is where the calls are happening to the server. And instead of showing magic happens, let's show one query. I think you have to, yeah, you have this. Yeah. So yeah, so the get patient, what we're telling here is, so I'm actually giving a DB connection. Show the server.js. Index and server index. I can minimize the profiles. Yeah. So when the entry happens, it first comes here, and then you see that the server is being built out, right? And it is being built out from the config parameters and all the other routes, right? So now let's go to server, and here is where we are specifying our connection. So I give some parameters in the config, and it's the server uses this to establish a connection. And here is where all the HTTPs are happening. So the routes are being built out here. Go to the is it in router utils or is it? So the server object is built out here with routes being established in this. Don't go scroll so fast. So if we are using a graphical endpoint, that's how it gets that graphical endpoint, and the server builds out that route for it. Right? So now let's go back to the resolver. So here all the connections are established. So when we say db server.db, the db is already part of the server object, and we're just simply saying that it's a collection, and you would find a collection as a patient, and this is how it needs to be defined in the backend. So if we right now we are using MongoDB, so if we use MongoDB, we need to say it's of collection patient, and in that is where we are specifying our search arguments. So identifier.id, and identifier should also be a search parameter that is coming from your client. And FHIR says that if you're searching on a specific field, then they also give a name to it. So it has to match to that field name. And then there are two possible options. Either there is an error or there is a resolution. If there is an error, then go and error. Otherwise, just resolve my patient. Resolve, what it does is it's a typical JavaScript implementation. It resolves the patient back to the client. Let's see the list. Yeah. So, and this is again program specific. Now let's also go to the FHIR spec. Any resource is fine. Or no, go to bundle. Yeah. So if you're doing a list implementation, and you can see entry here. So entry is where all the bundles are being loaded up into in a bundle. So in GraphQL, the way it is implemented is that if you, and this is something we need to take care, the asymmetric guys, because they don't know which database you will use, or will you use a database or not. They haven't given this, they have left it to the implementers. So here, if we use MongoDB, then you have to use certain syntax and the way you connect to it. And resolve entry, just line 54, yeah, resolve entry array. So what I'm doing here is, I'm getting a list of patients, and one by one, I am pushing them into my entry object of the bundle. And I have told the query that if it is a patient list, I'm going to use a schema of bundle, right? So that's how the pieces connect, and the resolution happens. That is probably pretty fast. let me pause here. Any questions? Nilesh, Santosh, who's the other gentleman? I couldn't see your name. You're asking the question.
Yeah, looks good.
Okay, all right. My connection is clear, right?
Yeah, it's much clearer.
Okay, great.
And you said you had to do some, yeah, you're connecting MongoDB in this, and you had to do MongoDB specific code in the get patient list. That mention is not there. You did it in some other file.
So what I'm showing you in the PowerPoint now is the way you would see on the asymmetric server. Okay. But I gave a link in the chat window for so even the MongoDB implementation, I made it open source. So it's available on the HL7 India GitHub repo. I've given a link to it in the chat. Yeah. So you can see that. The only caveat is that I need to update it a bit. I'll do that in 1 day's time. So got it. Yeah. So go to the resolver one more time. Yeah. So the resolver code depends on what kind of DB implementation we have, and if it is a document DB or a key value store DB, or is it a SQL, right? Because GraphQL doesn't care what database you use. It is for you to tell it that this is my database, right? So it's flexible in that sense. It's just a layer on top of your database. That's why it's an overhead in some cases where you don't need it. If you don't need it, then don't use it. Simple. So we need to, so let's assume if this is an RDBMS, right? So all of this would change. Instead of collection.found, I find I have to return the SQL version of it, right? So that's where we need to write this. specific code. Let's go to the PowerPoint and the next slide. So smart strategy. So in the config, we have seen the, can you show the config? Oh, sorry, is there a question?
Yeah. When you Atlas, yes, Atlas, you have shown it for a given resource type that this is how you're going to hit to the database and fetch all the records.
Yeah.
Right. So this would be just a boilerplate code, right, for all the resource types. Exactly. Is there any way where we can at least have it that, okay, I need the resource type which you require, and then you make it more generic in that way?
You mean, can you go to slide 22? So you're saying I don't want to see as many profiles here. Is that what?
Yeah, because you can have as many as profiles, but the only thing is that resolver should be at least very specific to a particular type.
Yeah. So that is why you write resolvers for each resource. So the profiles you see on that number 2 is all the profiles, and number 3 is an expansion of that. So for each and every profile, you would see a similar kind of thing. There would be a mutation, there will be a query, a register, and a resolver. So if you're writing patient resolver, then you are writing in this resolver under the patient resource. Did that answer?
The concern is that, okay, the same, I mean, for the simple case, right? Yes, I mean, I understand that there would be some more complex scenarios specific to a particular type of a resources. But for the simple cases like get for a patient or a get for a list of patients or a get list of a patient based on the certain conditions. So it would be just a boilerplate of code, right? Which would be repeated for all the resource types, right? So that was the case.
No, there are some certain subtleties.
Okay.
Let's go to the resolvers again, and can you show a appointment resolver? So we thought actually that we could make this as boilerplate and customize it for each and every query instead of having it in everything. Right? Oh, it's not here. So now the problem in having a boilerplate is that, so we wrote simple things like this resolver function. I'll show the resolver function. The way it works is you have linkages, right? So this resolver function is for location, right? Now in location, I have a managing organization. So if you are querying or if you are asking me to fetch the organization details, then I would have to do a get organization. And then GraphQL will go and get you the organization details for you, right? Similarly, if it is an appointment, I would have more fields in the resolver function. So generalizing it too much would probably be an issue. So if we are resolving certain specific elements related to that resource, it's better to handle those resolvers inside of that resolver for that profile.
Yeah, so in that case, tomorrow, if we are going to have some extensions on top of this particular profiles, which are the standard profiles, right? Then in that case, we have to head to this resolver and add those, because in the extensions also, we can have the extensions of any type.
That's right.
And if it is referencing to any specific resource, then again, we have to hit to this boiler code, and then maybe we have to extend this boiler code to support those new added fields, isn't it?
That is right. That is right. So I am actually looking how to generate. So there are a few things actually. Now, if you scroll down a little bit, so there is this collection.find1, right? So now this is a location resource, and I'm saying find it on the identifier, right? But there are more search fields. Now my query, my client might say that I want these 10 different set of fields with various combinations, right? Will I be able to fetch all of them in one boilerplate code? That's also an issue I'm running into. I think a lot of implementers are also thinking about how do we fulfill these multiple search criteria or even this resolution of those resources. Right?
Yeah,
I have,
exactly. So this is also one area.
yeah.
Because even for the existing search parameters might not be sufficient, so you can at least bring your new search parameters also on top of it. Yeah.
So I have found this to be the most workable solution as of now. But yeah, I mean, tomorrow if we found something good, we may have it. But ultimately, the underlining thing is to make the bundles lighter and resolve quickly. So if you have the boil, I mean, so and then the resource organization is similar, right? So if you have the boilerplate, then if you have to update it for 100 resources, then maybe you should do it. At least you are not updating one resource in 100 places. That's the silver lining. Yeah.
And this will also keep on varying as the new versions of the FHIR keeps on coming. So this will be keep on repeating it as well.
Yeah, so one good thing is, and I think that let's assume R5 is around the corner, I think, but let's assume R5 has come out. I think the asymmetric guys would make those definitions available in their folder. So we can just take those definitions instead of us having to break our head and write those schemas. So there is a reference link I have in the PowerPoint that the Facebook developers themselves say that don't write your own schema. Never, it will never work. So at least that will be made available. Right. So now let's go to Smart on FHIR. Yeah. So what Smart on FHIR strategy says is that you need to have a few things. You need to have an introspection URL. You need a client ID. And this was mostly built for a web to web. So they have included client secret also. But if it is a mobile client, you are not necessary to get a client secret always. And then it takes the token. There is a password flow which I have not explained. But what it does is it takes the token also from the config. It passes all of them to the introspection URL. And the introspection URL comes back with the resolution and it decodes and it says that, okay, this is fine. Then you will proceed ahead. If it is not matching for some reason, then the check fails here and it is stopped. This is step number one, just checking whether client ID, client secret, and introspection URL works correctly or not. And step number two is where we check for the scopes. And
Sorry, Venu, can I ask the context? This is when the application is external and trying to get into the EHR, right?
Yes, sir.
Or is it from the EHR?
Yeah, EHR is trying to get into the application.
Okay. Yeah, the application is trying to get into the EHR.
No, EHR is trying to get into the application.
Got it. All right.
Yeah.
So it's within the EHR.
Yeah, I mean, so EHR has its own schema, right? It's not FHIR. So when you're trying to get into FHIR is when the Smart on FHIR strategy is applied.
Gotcha. Fine.
Yeah.
I just wanted to know which context.
Yeah. So just checking, when you on top of Dr. Pramod's question, EHR is also an application here, right? Because this is what we're talking from the FHIR server perspective. So if EHR needs to talk, EHR is an application. And when you meant application, what did you mean by that?
Okay, so EHR can talk to a standalone app, right? Or EHR can talk to a FHIR server, right? Or EHR dynamically, because FHIR was, when it was conceptualized, it was mostly thought of as a transfer mechanism, right? So the Smart on FHIR strategy applies to FHIR resources. So any app that is trying to access the FHIR resources is where this strategy gets applied on. Did I make sense?
It makes sense. So in that perspective, EHR is an application, is a client to a FHIR server, right?
Yeah.
And external application, when you say talking of external application, you're talking of that application sitting on top of the EHR.
That's right.
That's and if that application, external application, has to talk to this FHIR server, it is going through the smart on FHIR authentication, the same way EHR also does it.
That's right. That's right. So EHR can also launch the from inside of EHR or outside of EHR. There are a few more. So there is a launch.
Yeah, because the context would be different then. No, if it is from inside the EHR within the patient. Versus. Okay.
Yeah. So that's the launch context. We'll come there in the next one.
Okay.
Yeah. So in the launch context, this server does not have launch, but what Smart on FHIR says is you can have a launch scope, and you can say launch patient, and you can even say what is my launch intent. There are a few examples. Can we go to the Smart on FHIR spec? No, go to HL7. So go to the one window you already opened. Just go to the search at the top. Just type search, and then the Google EBNF. Yeah, and search. Yeah, you got it. Yeah. So go to launch context. So yeah, so there are 3.2.1 requesting context with scope. So a launch, you can tell in multiple ways. Look, I'm trying to launch a patient. I'm trying to launch an encounter. Then the application can know the context and behave accordingly. However, I have a bit of a gray area here. And if you scroll a bit more, there is an intent. Yeah, there is an intent here. So intent, what it says is, okay, I'm launching the patient or launching the encounter, but what is my intent here? Is it, so there are the examples provided here is, I want to see a summary timeline view, recent history timeline, encounter focused timeline. There is a bit of gray area for me, at least, that I want to extend this to an emergency record viewer. So that's where like an EHR can say, I want to look for a patient's health record, and my intent is to an emergency flow or a break the glass flow. And
see is I would like to see if I'm a pediatrician, how many of my neonate in the ICU had an increased bilirubin, right? So I will give a timeline from the last 1 month. Tell me how many of the neonates that or how many neonates with increased bilirubin. That could be one. So there are many things that probably.
Yeah. So one thing that was not clear, Dr. Pramod, is, I mean, at least from a developer standpoint, go to the PowerPoint, is that the scopes are clear, at least at a resource level. At a resource level, I mean, you come with a resource and you come with a scope, and I will check whether you are allowed for that scope or not. And if you are not allowed, I'm throwing an error. If you are allowed, I'm giving you a resource, right? That is very clear. When it comes to launch and when it comes to launch intent, right? So probably then the application should say that I can support all these launch contexts and the intents, like you rightly said, right? And the application has to behave or probably even respond back or show you only that specific user interface. That is a bit of a gray area, and how to handle that, because it's not handled through authorization, at least.
It's not handled through authorization, is it?
Yeah, I mean,
that's where I was asking you if we could actually, for example, if we were asking for observation, okay, if I was giving rights to observation to a given application, whether I can filter those rights that I allowed that, or is it only all or none? See, observations are so many things here. It is, besides my history and besides my vitals and my exam, also the investigation results are observations, right? And I only want that app to look at my patients in a given date range, just the vitals or just BP. Got it? No.
Yeah.
That
So
is the only scope I want to give that guy, that application. Can that be done?
so there were a couple of references. There is a Heart Foundation or Heart Hospital reference, I think. It is possible to have multiple, so we are talking about granular scopes. So even within a resource, I want to specify even more granular.
Correct. Because a resource can be very, see, you take observations, it is such a big resource, right?
Yeah.
It is all the vitals, all the exam findings, all the lab investigations, all that comes under observation. So, I don't want to open up all the observations, or of my patients. There might be some investigations which are positive for HIV, right? Or they might be positive for some findings in mental problem in my examination.
Yeah.
That is the one issue which we have to look at. I was hoping that, we can look at.
Yeah, so the next thing is then we expand the scopes and we provide attribute level scopes, right?
Yeah.
But then the problem with such a thing is right now all these massively open ID providers, they don't support even these kind of scopes. So that's why we were using Okta and I was looking for an open source solution. Even if you have to get much more granular, then we have to even figure out a mechanism. So now Smart on FHIR is only at this level. So we have to figure out a mechanism. So that's attribute-based access control. But how do we handle that? Do we restrict in the scope itself, or do we make the application behave in a way? Like, so now if you take the case of India, so we have this consent manager, right? Mighty consent framework. So consent manager will also come into picture. So that is handled in a different manner, right? So how do we handle things at the scope level? How do we handle things at the consent level? And if we want much more granularity, how do we handle them is a question. We need to find
the consent manager thing actually is a very good question. So that means if I was in my EHR, a doctor in the EHR, and I just want to ask a question like, tell me who are the patients who are bilirubin positive or whatever, abnormal in the last 1 month, right? And I'm a pediatrician. And this is very important information because, for development of treatments and all that, that is a very important bit of information. That means, will I have to go and get consent from each of those people who's, who might fall within the category of being positive in bilirubin?
I'm not a right person to answer, but what I think is
that's a possibility because when I looked at Prajesh, are you here? Prajesh was here. He was here. When I was looking at the health data management draft, they have very clearly said any processing of a patient record needs specific patient consent. Okay. Anyway, I guess that's some beyond the scope. No, I'm just making you guys aware that what questions you're asking are very relevant when.
No, but there is also an implicit consent flow because consider the demographics. Implicit flow makes a lot of sense when it is correctly implemented along with the scope, right?
But that comes into play when the patient actually initiates the appointment or whatever. Okay.
Yeah, the consent, Dr. Pramod, here can be a blanket yes or a blanket no. If it is a blanket yes, then you don't need a consent and cheat transaction. But it depends on what the patient plans to decides to give.
No, I agree, Prajesh. But the point is that, when he's asking a query like this, which is very involved or very important for him as a doctor, for planning his treatment, or looking at what to do with his positive bilirubins or why it is so, he cannot even ask that query without going through a consent manager issue. Anyway, we'll take it offline. This is something we'll discuss. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's take it offline. Between Prajesh, you and me, let's discuss this.
Yeah, but just one point I would like to make is, so if you're coming in as a practitioner, right, then most probably you're assigned this scope and not the patient scope, right? Then I can make the application behave, and if the rules agree that in this case, just check for the patient, and if the consent manager says implicit consent, then you need not go for the patient's consent. If it is explicit by choice, then you have to go through that.
So what are the rules for implicit? And we'll talk later. That's what I said.
Yeah,
We'll talk later. What is implicit? What is explicit? Because implicit in the telemedicine practice guidelines is very clearly mentioned as when the patient initiates a consult. And I think that will be the same sort of thing that they will do in the consent manual.
Right.
Okay. Anyway, we'll talk later.
Yeah. And I think this is also something even global delivery or implementers across the world are trying to figure out. It would be nice if we get some answers for that. Any questions before we move to the next one?
No, nothing from me.
Right. So then, so Smart on FHIR, I briefly touched upon. So now, what are the open source opportunities? Let's say we want to work together and develop implementations that can be used by the community or even the wider perspective, right? We want to enable the FHIR resources. We want to create India-specific profiles and enable all the FHIR resources for any database. I think Shiva is Shiva on the call? Maybe not. So one of the things he mentioned was that we can make them database agnostic. So he wanted to he proposed an IOC. So that's one thing we want to do. We also want to sort out the Smart on FHIR implementation, or at least provide a basic guideline on how this could be implemented. Depending upon how the maturity of the FHIR profiles, we also want to implement the custom profiles, like the four custom profiles that's currently at NDHM and even more beyond, right? Extensions, all those kind of things. I am actually looking for a lot of contributions. The server code is there on the HL7 India GitHub library, and this will be open source. And the plan is to use as much open source as possible. Right. Then closing comments. So this is, so I mentioned a few references. Can you go to the references and we'll come to this. So Lanny Zamor and Adam Kramer were the GraphQL team. This is a YouTube video. It's a very good one. So in that, Adam Kramer, what he says is the one that I put on that closing slide number 31, where he says that we write code to read our own code and then look at the annotations for that code to write additional code, which is the code we execute with the GraphQL server. So what it means is, be careful whenever you are generating your GraphQL schemas. It's very tightly typed language. It helps you in making your queries lighter, but you need a lot more detail when you're trying to build a schema yourself. This is one main problem why developers of GraphQL have not been able to take full advantage of it. We have a very good implementation in FHIR. Right. Few of the references there we have is there are a very good GraphQL tutorials available on YouTube, because my intention was to not teach GraphQL. I'm not good at that. So the last two ones are very good. They take through, and it's a series of playlists. They take us through how to implement a GraphQL if you're interested in. They are like hello world examples, so not to take them too seriously. The asymmetric one is the real GraphQL implementation. So with that, I am at the end of my presentation. Any questions I will take? We have 4 minutes left.
Thanks, Manu, on this wonderful session. So yes, I mean, if you just go and check the GraphQL page on the FHIR, right? I mean, there is, I guess, it's still in the evaluation phase, right? It's not something that it can be easily adapted. So So what exactly the things are going on in the community from the FHIR community for the adoption of the GraphQL, maybe, and what we can expect in the new releases, if you have anything information on that.
No, so there is this official GraphQL thread on Zulip. I don't have anything apart from that. But what I would say is FHIR itself is in its infancy, and GraphQL is the hello world of it. So, so it's for developers to take it up, and this is open source, right? And then the choices have to be made. So, will I take a JavaScript route or will I not? Right. So let's say that you have a mobile app. Then what's the strategy to use FHIR on mobile? Maybe will you use FHIR on mobile? Possibly. Then if we use, then what is our strategy, right? So that's why it has to be a bottoms-up approach rather than waiting for announcements and waiting for things to happen.
This is Santosh.
Yes, Santosh.
Yeah. So as I see again, this is my first session with GraphQL. So as I see, right, GraphQL, the biggest advantage is when you compare to REST API, you can get what exactly you need from the client side. You can just query for that and leave out the rest. And especially it works with FHIR because if your FHIR has a bigger resource and you're talking of maybe giving the observation name, specific details high range, low range, you can just query with GraphQL endpoint and get the same and render it on the app. Is that the biggest advantage we're talking of here?
Yes, that is the biggest advantage.
Okay. So is it only like a query language? You can't update it?
Yeah, mutations are there. So yeah, if you see that playlist from yesterday, so mutation is the GraphQL world of doing updates, creates, and deletes. Mutations are also possible.
Okay.
Yeah.
It does all
yeah.
mutation.
But yeah, when you query, you have all these schemas and what variables you want and all that, right? While you are creating, you have to specify everything in that profile, in that resource. You cannot miss out on the fields that you want, right? So it's a straightforward push in that case.
Got it.
Yeah.
It's just a standard post.
Yeah. Okay, so with that, thank you so much for your time. Yesterday and today I've taken 3 hours of yours, but thank you for the participation. Look out for some announcements, either in the next monthly meetup or in the community. We'll ask for some contribution and collaboration. If you have time, please join us. Thank you so much.
One last question, Venu.
Sure.
Yeah. So now you have forked out from this Asymmetrik GitHub, right? And we are contributing this. And there is a simultaneous releases also that comes from Asymmetrik. So how does that merge happen? We want to take any new updates the Asymmetrik team is doing there, right, as well?
We want to. So right now there are not many merges that are coming there. Asymmetrik, so it's not the same as the other happy kind of implementations. Asymmetrik waits for the official release to happen, like R5, and then they do a release. Or let's say that right now there are two issues open. So let's assume that somebody has done a pull for fixing the one of those directives, flatten directive. They would do a release. Then we want to pull it. So it's not a rapidly active library. It was active a few days back. Now it is more or less settled.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks everyone, and have a great Sunday. Thank you. Bye.